The case we present today had its beginnings in the late 19th century, within a remote region of the Appalachians in the United States. Around 1880, a family of settlers established itself in the mountains, within a valley naturally isolated by geographical features. The Jackson family, as they came to be known, started with just 24 people who, in their search for religious isolation, decided to sever all ties with the outside world. For the small group, the patriarch Joseph Jackson established strict rules. No contact with strangers was permitted. Marriages were to occur only between members of the community itself. And leaving the valley was considered an unforgivable betrayal. What began as a quest for religious purity soon transformed into an involuntary genetic experiment. The community grew slowly over the first 30 years. Marriages between first cousins became commonplace, and by the end of the first generation, the initial signs of genetic problems were already observable. There were children with mild malformations, learning difficulties, and a high incidence of infant mortality. By the time the second generation was born around 1910, more serious problems were already presenting themselves. The recessive genes, now duplicated due to marriages between close relatives, began to manifest more evidently. Children were born with congenital heart problems, extra fingers, cleft palates, and mental retardation. The situation was only aggravated by the absence of adequate medical care and absolute isolation. When the third generation was reached in the 1930s, the situation grew increasingly dramatic. By this time, practically all inhabitants of the valley shared a large portion of their genetic material. It was no longer merely a matter of cousins marrying each other, but of people who were simultaneously cousins, uncles, and nephews within a genetic web so intricate it would be impossible to map with precision. Contributing to the feeling that this small world was all that existed was the region's harsh climate, with severe winters that isolated the community even further. Children born during this period grew up believing their physical and mental conditions were normal, since practically everyone around them presented some type of deformity or limitation. The emergence of a peculiar syndrome marked the fourth generation, born around 1950, which became locally known as the Jackson mark. Due to a rare genetic condition called methemoglobinemia, caused by an enzyme deficiency, children were born with a bluish coloration of the skin. Additionally, severe facial malformations became common, featuring underdeveloped jaws, widely spaced eyes, and malformed ears. By the time the 1970s and the fifth generation were reached, alarming signs of genetic deterioration were already showing. Fertility had drastically decreased while infant mortality reached frightening levels of 60%. The children who did survive often could not speak or walk and presented malformations so severe that some could barely be recognized as human. It was only in 1983 that the case came to light, when a 16-year-old girl, Mary Jackson, managed to escape the valley during a storm that damaged part of the fence surrounding the property. The story Mary told seemed straight out of a nightmare. Generations living in total isolation, forced marriages between close relatives, children born with increasingly severe deformities, and all this just a few dozen kilometers from civilization. Initially skeptical, the police organized an expedition to the valley, and what they found confirmed and exceeded Mary's accounts. In the valley lived about 240 people, practically all with some degree of physical deformity or cognitive limitation. Authorities discovered the community had developed its own communication system, since many members could not properly articulate words. Living conditions were primitive, without electricity or running water, and many inhabitants had never seen a car or watched television. Shocked by what they found were the health and medical authorities who examined the community members. Many presented conditions doctors had only seen in textbooks, and some deformities were so rare they didn't even have official nomenclature. If you want to follow more cases like this, which affect all of society and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any investigation. When authorities began the investigation into the Jackson case in February 1983, the first difficulty was establishing the identity of each community member. No one had official documents, and the naming system used was as confusing as the family's genealogical tree itself. Many people shared the same name, usually honoring the community's founders, making it almost impossible to determine who was whose child. Investigators discovered the community maintained rudimentary records, mainly an ancient Bible where births and deaths were noted. However, these records were inconsistent and often deliberately obscure, hiding the true nature of relationships. The annotations frequently omitted parents' names or used vague terms like child of the valley for children born from particularly close relationships. One of the first witnesses to cooperate was Martha Jackson, a woman of approximately 50 years who, despite showing evident physical signs of consanguinity, maintained sufficient cognitive capacity to communicate coherently. Martha revealed that since childhood, she had been taught the outside world was dangerous and impure, and that only within the family did the blood remain clean. Marriages were decided by the Council of Elders, Martha reported. When a girl turned 13, the elders would meet and determine which man would be her husband. Nobody questioned these decisions. Martha revealed she was simultaneously the cousin and aunt of her husband, and that her father was also her great-uncle. The investigation faced significant resistance from older community members. The elders, led by Ezekiel Jackson, a 70-year-old man who claimed to be the guardian of family tradition, refused to cooperate and insisted authorities had no right to interfere with their customs. "We've lived this way for generations," declared Ezekiel. "Pure blood has kept us strong against the corrupted world." This declaration drastically contrasted with the physical reality of the valley's inhabitants. Doctors who examined the community identified a series of rare genetic conditions that had become common due to consanguinity: Apert syndrome, characterized by craniofacial malformations and fusion of fingers; Meckel syndrome, causing encephalocele, protrusion of the brain through the skull; and polydactyly, and various other conditions that individually are extremely rare in the general population. A particularly disturbing discovery was made when investigators found what was called the House of Special Children. It was an isolated cabin where children with the most severe deformities were kept, some chained to rudimentary beds. These children, many of whom could not feed themselves or control basic bodily functions, received minimal care and, according to reports, frequently died during winter. The investigation also revealed the community had developed its own mythology to explain the deformities. Children born with serious problems were considered marked by God as a test of faith. In some cases, specific deformities were interpreted as signs of spiritual power, and some of the most severely affected children were treated as oracles whose inarticulate sounds were interpreted as divine messages. As the investigation progressed, researchers began to realize they were facing an unprecedented case in modern medical literature. Never before had a community that practiced systematic consanguinity for so many consecutive generations been documented. Geneticist Dr. Robert Keller, who participated in the investigation, described the case as an involuntary genetic experiment that revealed the extreme limits of what happens when the gene pool becomes critically reduced. The investigation team faced another significant obstacle: the absence of an adequate legal framework to deal with the situation. Technically, consanguineous marriages were illegal in the state, but as none of the marriages had been officially registered, it was difficult to determine which laws had been violated. Additionally, many of those originally responsible for implementing this practice had already died. A turning point in the investigation occurred when researchers found evidence that the community had not been completely isolated the entire time. Recovered documents indicated that occasionally, men from the community made incursions to nearby towns to acquire essential supplies. More disturbing still, there were indications that occasionally women from outside were brought to the valley, usually against their will, in an attempt to renew the blood. Sarah Williams, a 62-year-old woman who lived in a nearby town, recognized some specific facial characteristics in photographs shown by investigators. She revealed that her younger sister had disappeared in 1952 when she was only 17 and was never seen again. "We always believed she had run away to the big city," said Sarah. "We never imagined she could be so close, living a nightmare." The investigation also faced profound ethical dilemmas. How to proceed with community members who had been victims but also perpetrators of the system? How to reintegrate into society people who had never been exposed to the modern world and who, in many cases, presented significant cognitive limitations? And perhaps most importantly, how to deal with recently born children, many of whom needed urgent medical interventions? As these complex questions were debated, investigators continued to unravel the history of the Jackson community. Each discovery seemed more disturbing than the previous one, revealing layers of isolation, abuse, and genetic deterioration that extended for more than a century. In August 1983, 6 months after the investigation began, researchers made a discovery that fundamentally changed their understanding of the case. During excavation of an area near the community cemetery, the remains of more than 300 children were found, many of whom presented extreme bone deformities. Subsequent analyses revealed these graves dated from different periods over the last 100 years, indicating the infant mortality rate was even higher than initially suspected. Forensic examinations of the remains revealed consistent patterns of malformations that worsened with passing generations. The oldest graves contained skeletons with relatively mild anomalies, extra fingers or partial bone fusions. The more recent graves presented extreme deformities, drastically malformed skulls, absence of limbs, and cases of conjoined twins who had not survived birth. Dr. Elizabeth Norcross, a geneticist specializing in rare hereditary diseases, was called to analyze genetic data collected from living community members. Using advanced techniques for the time, she managed to partially reconstruct the Jackson family's genealogical tree. "What we discovered is unprecedented in medical literature," she declared. "The coefficient of consanguinity in the most recent generation surpasses anything ever documented in human populations. In some cases, we're talking about individuals who share more than 70% of their genetic material. Something that should theoretically be impossible in a viable population." Dr. Norcross identified more than 40 rare genetic conditions within the community, many of which normally occur in less than 1 in 100,000 people in the general population. Most alarming, however, was the discovery that some of the observed conditions were completely new to medical science, combinations of genetic anomalies that had never been documented before, resulting from the unique interaction of multiple recessive mutations that would rarely have the opportunity to manifest together in a population with normal genetic diversity. In September 1983, the investigation took another surprising turn when one of the youngest community members, 19-year-old Jacob Jackson, began cooperating extensively with authorities. Jacob, who presented relatively mild facial deformities and preserved cognitive capacity, revealed he had suspected for years that something was wrong with his community. "When I was a child, I found a basic biology book among the supplies that men brought from town," he recounted. "That's when I realized that what they told us about being special and chosen wasn't true. We were sick, and our leaders knew it." Jacob revealed the existence of hidden documents kept by the elders, which included newspaper clippings and even scientific articles about genetics and heredity. "They knew what they were causing," he stated. In private meetings, the elders discussed which marriages would produce fewer monsters, as they called them. It wasn't ignorance. It was deliberate control. This revelation transformed the nature of the investigation, which began to include criminal aspects. If what Jacob claimed was true, the community leaders had deliberately perpetuated practices they knew to be harmful, effectively condemning generations of children to lives of suffering. The investigation received another boost when scientists managed to analyze DNA samples preserved in the personal objects of Joseph Jackson, the community's founder. The results were surprising. Joseph already carried genes for several rare recessive conditions, including methemoglobinemia, that which caused the bluish skin coloration in many of his descendants. This finding suggested the decision to establish an isolated community and practice consanguineous marriages may have been motivated in part by the desire to hide a pre-existing genetic condition. In October 1983, authorities made another disturbing discovery in a sealed basement in the community's main house, diaries kept by generations of Jackson women, reporting in agonizing detail the births, deformities, and premature deaths. These diaries, written in a mixture of archaic English and a dialect developed by the community itself, revealed that not everyone had passively accepted the imposed system. There were reports of escape attempts, of women trying to avoid pregnancies, and even of merciful infanticides when children were born with deformities incompatible with life. One of the diaries, dated 1937, contained a particularly moving passage. "Today I gave birth to what should be my son, but God in his infinite cruelty transformed into something I cannot recognize as human. His eyes are where his cheeks should be, and there is no sign of nose or mouth. He did not breathe, thanks to divine mercy. The elder says it is a test of our faith. But what kind of God tests his children this way? I begin to suspect it is not God who tests us, but the men who speak in his name." As these documents were translated and analyzed, a more complex image of the community began to emerge. It was not simply a group uniformly committed to fanatical beliefs, but a hierarchical social structure where an elite of male leaders maintained absolute control over others, using a mixture of religious indoctrination and physical isolation. Leave in the comments, never give up on truth. If you believe that all missing persons deserve to be found, all victims deserve justice, and all closed communities need to be investigated. In November 1983, after 9 months of intense investigation, authorities made the decision to definitively intervene in the Jackson community. The operation, which involved medical teams, social workers, psychologists, and police forces, was carefully planned to minimize trauma in a population that had never had significant contact with the outside world. The 237 surviving community members were evacuated from the valley and temporarily housed in adapted facilities at a state hospital. There, each individual underwent complete medical evaluations, which confirmed the devastating extent of damage caused by generations of consanguinity. The examination results were alarming. 98% of community members presented some genetic condition associated with consanguinity. Among children under 10 years old, 100% presented multiple conditions, many of which required immediate medical intervention. Dr. James Harlow, coordinator of the medical team, declared, "In my 35 years of medical practice, I have never seen so many rare conditions concentrated in a single group. We are essentially witnessing the final result of a genetic experiment that no ethics committee would ever allow." Authorities faced unprecedented legal and ethical questions, as there were no official records of birth, marriage, or death. The legal status of each community member had to be established from scratch. For the children, this meant creating complete legal identities, including birth certificates that in many cases could only estimate their ages. The question of criminal responsibility was also complex. Investigators identified 12 elders who appeared to have knowledge of the risks of consanguinity and still imposed it on the community. However, many of these men also presented cognitive limitations resulting from previous generations of consanguinity. How to evaluate the culpability of individuals who themselves were products and victims of the system they perpetuated. After extensive deliberations, authorities opted to focus on rescue and rehabilitation aspects rather than punishment. Ezekiel Jackson and 2 other elders who demonstrated full cognitive capacity were charged with various crimes, including child abuse and criminal negligence. The others were considered unable to respond criminally due to their limitations. In January 1984, the difficult process of integrating community members into modern society began. For adults, especially the older ones, the transition was extremely traumatic. Many never fully adapted and spent the rest of their lives in specialized institutions, unable to process the vastness and complexity of the world beyond the valley. For children, the prognosis was more promising, although still challenging. Those with preserved cognitive capacities demonstrated surprising resilience and adaptability. Mary Jackson, whose escape had initiated the entire investigation, became an inspiring example. After intensive medical treatments and therapy, she managed to complete high school and eventually became an advocate for the rights of people with genetic disabilities. The most severely affected children were welcomed into specialized institutions where they received medical care that, although unable to reverse existing deformities, managed to significantly improve their quality of life. Surgical procedures corrected some of the physical malformations, while therapeutic interventions helped in developing basic skills. In 1985, the Jackson Foundation was established to coordinate ongoing care and support research on the rare genetic conditions observed in the community. Genetic material collected from family members became a valuable source for researchers worldwide, helping to identify specific genes associated with various rare conditions and contributing to the development of predictive genetic tests. The valley where the community lived for more than a century was transformed into a natural reserve, with a small memorial honoring the hundreds of victims of an involuntary human experiment. The plaque at the memorial contains a simple message, in memory of those who lived and died in isolation, and as a reminder of our collective responsibility to protect the most vulnerable. The Jackson case generated significant changes in public policies related to isolated communities. Several states implemented monitoring programs to identify potentially at-risk groups, especially those with unconventional religious structures that could facilitate abuse. These programs faced the delicate balance between respecting religious freedom and protecting vulnerable individuals, especially children. In the field of genetics, the case led to renewed academic interest in the effects of consanguinity on human populations. Comparative studies with other historically isolated populations, such as Amish communities, Mennonites, and island groups, helped establish clearer parameters about risks associated with different degrees of kinship. In 2003, 20 years after the community's discovery, a team of documentarians managed to locate and interview 45 survivors. Their testimonies revealed diverse trajectories. Some had managed to fully integrate into mainstream society, forming families and building careers. Others lived in assisted communities, requiring continuous support. And some remained institutionalized, their bodies and minds permanently marked by the involuntary genetic experiment to which they had been subjected. Jacob Jackson, who had been fundamental in exposing knowledge deliberately suppressed by the elders, became a geneticist and dedicated his career to studying rare diseases. "What happened to my family cannot be undone," he declared at a medical conference in 2010. "But we can ensure these lives were not lost in vain. Each gene identified, each mechanism understood, each child saved from a condition we can now prevent or treat, is a victory over the obscurantism that kept my family in captivity for generations." Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Jackson case is the awareness about the risks of consanguinity and the importance of genetic diversity for the health of human populations. In countries where marriages between cousins continue to be culturally accepted, educational programs now include information about genetic risks and offer premarital counseling and testing. The preserved genetic samples from the Jackson community continue to be a valuable resource for researchers. In 2015, using genetic sequencing technologies that didn't exist when the case came to light, scientists managed to identify specific patterns of genetic deterioration over the 7 generations, providing unprecedented insights into how the human gene pool responds to extreme isolation. The case of the 7 generations of the Jackson family remains one of the most extreme and well-documented examples of the effects of prolonged consanguinity in humans. It is a story of isolation, control, and suffering, but also of resilience, scientific discovery, and finally, redemption through knowledge. If you watched until here, it's because you care about these cases that mark families forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here, so I can get to know you and know who really cares about the search for truth." Don't forget to like this video so it reaches more people, and share it with friends who are interested in real cases. If you're not yet subscribed to the channel, this is the ideal moment to become part of our community that isn't afraid to face humanity's most difficult truths, ***. Next week, we'll bring another equally impactful case that will reveal how seemingly normal communities can hide disturbing secrets for decades. Until then, remember, truth, however painful it may be, is always the first step toward healing.